folks. Welcome to part 2 of our China Clipper adventure. This is my attempt to recreate in Microsoft Flight Simulator the original flight of the China Clipper in November of 1935. The history is in the first video, but by way of very brief review, the China Clipper was a 4-engine Martin M130 flying boat operated by Pan American Airways. And she became the first aircraft to cross an ocean in commercial service. And not just any ocean, but the Pacific Ocean at its midpoint. In November 1935, she flew from Alameda, California, across the Pacific to Manila, Philippines, linking North America with Asia, and thus ushering in a whole new era of aviation. Now, the previous video, we flew the first leg from Alameda, California to Honolulu. We're currently sitting in Pearl Harbor. It's dawn, November 23rd, 1935, and we are ready to continue on the second leg of our trip. This is Pearl Harbor. We are right over here on the west side of the Pearl City Peninsula. And as a very brief aside, I want to show you something. This dock I showed you in the last video, this is the original Pan Am dock. It's still there. And I said that there was a picture down here that showed a plaque. And indeed it does. You notice this user picture, China Clipper Pier, 1935. There's a picture of the pier as it looks today with all this vegetation sticking out of it, and we don't really care about that. Here's the plaque that's at the base of it that I was telling you about. Just wanted to show you this real quick. It is still there in Google Earth. China Clipper, 1935 to 1985. Middle Lock, Pearl City Peninsula, original landing site of the China Clipper. This plaque was dedicated November 22nd, 1985, celebrating 50 years of trans-Pacific service by Pan American. So, we landed November 22nd, 1935. It is now the next morning, and that's where we're sitting. We're going to fly from Honolulu to Midway Island, which is a small atoll up here on the northwestern corner of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And here is Midway Island. The airport wasn't there, of course. Neither was this airport. The reason we're flying a flying boat is because there weren't many large airports in the world in 1935, so we landed on the water. And this was the original site of the Pan Am facilities. There were a couple docks right here, and the Pan Am Village with a hotel for passengers, though that came a little bit later. We're just flying cargo right now. But the hotel area called Gooneeville was right in here, and that's where we'll be spending tonight in the crew rest quarters once we complete our flight. Now, I want to keep this video more, well, I won't really say shorter because I don't think it will be shorter, even though this is a shorter flight, but I want to keep this video more concise than the last one, and try not to spend as much time making things up as I go and looking around, sightseeing, flying around Oahu, so on and so forth. So, that's the flight. If you check out our flight plan here, I've already got set up, you can see we're planning on it taking us 9 hours and 26 minutes. It is a flight of 1,163 miles. And so, we should arrive around 3:30 local time per the winds we're guesstimating on our flight plan here. Now, like I said, I want to keep the video more concise, so we're basically ready to go. Before we take off, though, there are two things I want to talk about, one of which was requested by people who saw the first video, and the other one is something we just need to talk about to lay some groundwork for this flight. But I know that there are a lot of people who aren't interested in the level of detail and historical accuracy I'm trying to bring to this for those who are interested in it, and that's completely okay. We all have different levels of interest in this stuff. So, if you're not interested in hearing these next two segments, I will, as always, put links in the timeline. You can, put links to the timeline in the description of the video, so you can just skip ahead to the departure point in the video and go flying with us. For everyone who is interested, the two things I want to talk about before we go flying are, number one, I've had some questions about my flight planning workflow and how it works with this self-calculating navlog that I briefly showed you in the first video, but we really didn't talk about how it works at all. So I'm going to run you through that. And then the second thing we're going to talk about is a description of the HfDf, the HF direction finding that was invented by Pan American for this Trans-Pacific service. And the Navy adopted this technology. It really changed aerial navigation. Thus far, on the first leg, we navigated purely by dead reckoning and celestial navigation. We're going to introduce the HfDf on this leg to Midway, and so I'm going to give you a rundown on that. If you're not interested in the details of either of those things and you just want to go flying, skip ahead to the departure segment. For everyone else, stick around and let's talk about navigation. Alright, navigation. You know, for me, this is one of the most interesting parts of trying to recreate the classic flying, and it continues to amaze me that it works in Flight Simulator, that you can use real-world courses and distances and things like that for dead reckoning calculations, and the world in Flight Simulator is modeled accurately enough that those dead reckoning calculations work. So this is something that I enjoy the planning of the flights almost as much probably as I enjoy the flying of them. You may not agree with me there, but if you are trying to do any of this classic flying in Flight Sim yourself, you do have to do some navigating. It's just the way it is. So the first thing you need, just like in real life, is you need a map. Well, there are places, depending on where you're flying in the world, to find online charts to use for flight planning, but really Google Earth I found is just the simplest one. I mean, it's available to everybody. It covers the entire planet. There's no worries about lack of coverage, and so I use Google Earth as my chart. And I talked about this in my sextant tutorial video, but I'll show you here just in case you haven't seen that. One thing, if you are going to use Google Earth as a charting application, it's fantastic as long as you do this one thing. Tools, options, elevation exaggeration. You want to turn that off. You want to set it to 0, and it will default to something like 0.01, I'm sorry. And that makes Google Earth behave as a flat chart instead of an Earth, basically. As you zoom in and out, it keeps elevation exaggeration from kicking in for mountains and things like that. And when you're trying to line different lines up over waypoints and things like that, it just makes it work much better. So we now have a flat chart in Google Earth. Next thing you need to do is draw a course line. The ruler tool is what you use for this. And if you just want to draw a line, use the line tool. And you can start at your departure point, draw a line to your destination, and Google Earth does draw great circle lines. You see if I pull this all the way around the planet, how the line becomes curved. This is a great circle course between those two places. Over open ocean, most of the time, one line's all you need. This was one line from Alameda to Honolulu. Most of the, and matter of fact, I think all the other segments, at least as far as I've looked so far, are straight lines. But you'll notice for this one, I actually drew a path that chains together all the little islands along the way. As it turns out, this second segment was known as the, navigationally speaking, the easiest leg of the flight from Honolulu to Midway. All you had to do was follow these islands. It was really the only leg of the flight where the navigator had a series of regularly spaced visual landmarks. And I know what you're thinking. This adds distance to the flight. Yes, it does. And airlines are so hyper concerned about efficiency. Would they really have flown like this? Well, they did, okay? I've compared the distance of this path I drew to the straight line distance from Honolulu to Midway. Flying over all these little islands adds 33 miles. Now that's really basically nothing when you weigh it against the safety advantages of flying over identifiable visual landmarks. So we're going to do that. So the point is, if you want to draw a line, a course line, that connects points like this with course changes, use the path tool instead. And then every time you click a point, it makes a path. When you're done with that, you save your line, name it whatever you want, make it whatever color you want, and you have a course line. You'll notice now if I right-click on this course line, Properties, I get a distance, 1,165 miles. If you need to measure courses, you can do so. Switch back to the line tool, and for instance, if I want to measure the course from Necker Island to French Frigate Shoals, this is Turn Island up here. Go to the Turn Island Airport. If you look in the ruler tool box there, you can see you have a map length and a ground length, which are the same. So this is about 89 miles, this line I've drawn, and it's a course of 281.8 degrees. I would round that to 282 degrees. So, just like using a plotter on a paper chart, there you go. You can do it all digitally, and it covers the entire world, and it's free. Personally, I think that's hard to beat. So, I create a course line in Google Earth. I then create checkpoints on that course line. And in this case, my checkpoints all correspond to visual landmarks, pieces of land that exist in Flight Sim. I've verified them all. We can fly over them and find them. And they're regularly spaced enough that I just used them as my checkpoints. When you're flying over open ocean, you can see my checkpoint 7, checkpoint 8, checkpoint 9. I just take checkpoints at a distance that gives me about an hour flying time between each checkpoint. And I don't consider winds at different points on the route. I just say, okay, still air, I can plan about 130 knots of ground speed, so I measure every 130 miles to make a checkpoint. Now, if you're going to use this self-calculating navlog, which is very cool, and I highly recommend using it. It was made available by someone on the A2A forum. He posted it on the A2A Constellation forum on the A2A forum's website. And this is a really great thing. And if you're going to use this, the easiest way to create the flight plan is actually to create a flight plan in Plan G, which is another free tool. I'm assuming most simmers who are, have messed around with flight simming for a while probably have Plan G or at least familiar with it. Recreate your course in Plan G. This is all I use Plan G for, because the problem with Plan G is that, as far as I know, there's no plotting utility in it. There's nothing that emulates the ruler tool here in Google Earth. I don't know how you can draw lines and measure courses and distances in Plan G. If somebody does know, let me know. But with Google Earth, I can plot my course line. I can plot any lines of position I get from celestial observations or the HfDf that we're going to start using. So I use Google Earth for my plotting utility. So I need my course in Google Earth with all my checkpoints. So I start there and I do it first. Then I create the course in Plan G. And I'm assuming that if you've played with Plan G at all, this isn't going to be a mystery what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and create a flight plan. I'm not going to do the whole thing, just show you the very basics of it. Start the flight plan at airport NPS. That's because Plan G is designed to work with Flight Simulator. Flight plans have to start and end at airports, which doesn't always work out real well, right? But in this case, there are, per the Flight Simulator scenery, airports at both ends of our trip, and that's true for everywhere we're going, so it actually works out okay for this this China Clipper recreation. So I've started my flight plan at Ford Island Naval Air Station, which is square in the middle of Pearl Harbor. It's perfect. And PMDY is Midway Island up here. So we actually have, we can say at airport PMDY to flight plan. There we go. Now we have a flight plan from Ford Island to Midway. Great. The thing is, we had all these checkpoints we wanted to use, didn't we? So this is a perfect leg to demonstrate this on, because it doesn't have to just be a straight line. If you wanted to just add your regular checkpoints, you would grab the lat longs from these guys that you already drew in Google Earth, spaced 1 hour apart, and add them. But in this case, we're actually going to add the lat longs of these actual islands. But the process is exactly the same. Nihoa is our first checkpoint, right? I put a pin on it in Google Earth. You just grab the pin tool, drop this pin wherever you want it, right? In this case, I dropped it right on the little island of Nihoa. You can then right-click that pin anytime you want, go to Properties, and you get the latitude and longitude for it. Now you notice that this is in decimal degrees. Google Earth, another great thing about Google Earth, is it lets you change how you show coordinates. different utilities want coordinates in different formats. With Google Earth, it's just as easy as going up here into Tools and selecting what you need. Right now we need decimal degrees, so that's what we'll stick with. And then when we look at the coordinates of Nihoa, there they are in decimal degrees. So we're going to create a user waypoint on our flight plan. And this is something about Plan G that kind of annoys me. I wish I could simultaneously create a user waypoint and have it added to my flight plan. And I can't, but it's not that hard. To make a user waypoint, you just right-click somewhere, create user waypoint. We can use a star. We'll name it Nihoa. Very original, right? And all we need is the latitude and longitude in decimal format. So we just go back to Google Earth. You can't have the little degree symbol. That pisses off Plan G, so skip that. But just copy your latitude. Control V to paste it in. Copy your longitude, skipping that degree symbol. Paste it in. And, okay. There we have our user waypoint. Now you'll notice if you zoom out too far, they're not visible. So sometimes you'll go hunting for this thing. In this case, it's pretty easy because it's right along our path. But you can search for a user waypoint just like you can search for anything else in Plan G by using the find, in this case, find user waypoint. It'll center you on it. Once you find the user waypoint, which you'll see centers right over the island of Nihoa, you right-click the user waypoint, and you go Add User Waypoint Nihoa to Plan. Great. However, you'll see that what happened is every time you add something to your flight plan, it adds it at the end of the flight plan. So now we're flying all the way to Midway and coming all the way back to Nihoa. Not what we want to do, but these are drag and drop, easy to rearrange. Just put Nihoa above Midway Island. And now we have a waypoint on Nihoa. I'll show you one more, just for illustration. Create user waypoint again. And in this case, we're going to create what is our next waypoint. Kind of funny that the dialog box stays above Google Earth, but it actually helps. After Nihoa, next one's Necker Island. So, get the coordinates for Necker here. Not sure if that copied. Necker. Okay. And here's Necker down here. Right-click Necker, add user waypoint Necker to flight plan. And then in the flight plan dialog up here, drag it up above Midway. So now here's our flight plan. Ford Island, to Nihoa, to Necker, and on to Midway. And so on. So you just keep adding waypoints until you've got your whole flight plan in here. Let me finish that. Okay, and here is our completed flight plan. And you'll notice that I added identifying names to each one of these user waypoints as well. That'll help. Now, the reason we did that is because we want to use this flight plan. And I'll tell you, I just recorded this segment, and I actually made a small video tutorial of how to fill this thing out. And in the demonstration of that, geez, it took like 35 minutes. We don't need to do that. It comes with good instructions. Let me just tell you that if you're going to use this thing, follow the instructions. Do not second guess the instructions. Do not read a step and go, well, that's just eye candy. I'll come back to that later. Maybe it's eye candy. But there are a lot of bits of information that are required for this thing to do its job. And if you start trying to second guess which ones are required and which ones aren't, you will inevitably screw it up and spend longer trying to figure out why it's not working than you would have if you just followed the instructions. So follow the instructions. Just a general overview of this thing. When you open it up, and you may get a security warning saying that macro content has been disabled, be sure you enable active content. Otherwise, the macros that do all the calculations for you can't calculate anything. So be sure you do that. after you do that, you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of tabs along the bottom of this Excel spreadsheet. Now, I assume you're familiar with using Excel. If not, I mean, I can't teach you how to use Excel. But there are a number of pages or or sheets, I think these things are called. I'm not sure what the proper term for them is. Tabs is how I think of them. There's a logbook, there's your flight plan section, a notes section, which could be more precisely named. This is actually all critical performance information. If you don't fill it out, the flight plan won't do anything. So don't think of it as just being extra because it's called notes. You need this. The navlog you're going to fill out in flight. Schedule. The hangar where you define aircraft you're going to fly, and then some predefined performance tabs for aircraft that it comes with. This is the A2A Stratocruiser, the Manfred Johns DC-3, the C-47. That's a freeware airplane. This is the PMDG DC-6, the Constellation, the A2A Constellation. And I'm not using any of those because we have defined our own airplane, the Martin M130. In general, to use this thing, if I remember the workflow correctly, you first define an airplane, then you define a flight. So here's PAA2 from Honolulu to Midway, put the times in, so now we have PAA2. Now you can come over to the flight plan section and you can select PAA2 from a drop-down list. And when you do, it autofills a lot of relevant information for you. On this flight plan, or this workbook, anything green shaded is a required entry from you. Anything red shaded is auto-calculated by the spreadsheet. And anything yellow shaded is completely extra. So the flight crew list, that's just extra. There is a cargo and passenger count. You have to put your payload in over here. And then what you'll do is you'll take that flight plan that we just created in Plan G, and you'll copy the whole thing, and this is important. Do not use copy route. That's not what we're doing. We need to copy the entire flight plan, which means you need to click the little box next to the first waypoint, and that selects that line. Scroll down to the bottom of your flight plan, mouse over that little box on the last line, hold down the Shift key, and click to select the whole flight plan. And then you will hit Control-C to copy it. You will go to your Excel spreadsheet. Come on. Great. Well, Plan G crashed. That's okay. We were done with it. You'll go to your Excel spreadsheet, and you will under the Plan G Flight Plan section. This will be blank, okay? You will click in the upper left box right here, and you will hit Control-V to paste, and it will paste all the flight plan data in. That will auto-populate this entire flight plan section. You then need to go to the Notes section, fill out all the relevant performance data. Don't skip anything, okay? Everything with a green shaded box is something you need to fill in. Yes, I know I skipped diversion fuel. You'll see it calculates to 0. Down here in the engine settings, you need to have a climb line filled out. You need to have at least one cruise line filled out, and you define the points over here. And then you need to have a descent line filled out. You can have multiple cruise lines if you want to use different altitudes and you want it to calculate different winds for different sections of the flight. You'll do that with a drop-down list over here. Once you enter that, you can go back to Flight Plan, and you have to enter, well, you don't have to, but you can enter some wind data. You can create up to 5 zones for weather for your flight. I only created 2 because in the Pacific in 1935, how much upper air weather data do you think they had? Not very much. I imagine they launched a weather balloon from Honolulu and gave us the winds aloft, and I imagine they launched a weather balloon from Midway and gave us the winds aloft. And so I split the flight into 2 zones. Notice you can select this here. So I selected from, that NPS is Ford Island in Pearl Harbor, so the beginning of the flight, from Ford Island to French Frigate Shoals. Yeah, it's roughly half the flight. I just drew a line somewhere in the middle. And so here's French Frigate Shoals. So for the first half of the flight, we're using upper wind data from Honolulu. For the second half of the flight, we're going to use upper wind data from Midway Island. It would seem to bring a realistic level of inaccuracy based on the limited data they had at that time, right? So we've defined the two zones, Ford Island to French Frigate Shoals, and then the next one's Gardner Pinnacles to Midway. Here's the wind data, and he has set this up so you can actually copy and paste the upper wind data right in from Active Sky Next, which is what I did. So these are the Honolulu upper level winds. This is the Midway Island upper level winds. And you'll see there's little green bars next to them. The length of the bar indicates the efficiency of that altitude band, and you can see this turns into a real headwind, which hurts real bad, and that's why the little green bar goes away. And once you've entered wind data, the one thing I'll show you that's pretty cool is you can see I entered two zones for my flight. The first zone at 10,000 feet, the second zone at 8,000 feet. And the zones are defined as top of climb to French Frigate Shoals, and then from French Frigate Shoals to the top of descent. And then there's your descent to landing down there, your descent line. The reason I did this to fly at different altitudes is because you can then play with your altitudes and watch your time, okay? So I want the best altitude for this last segment, 5 hours and 34 minutes. That's my time right now. I'm at 8,000 feet. What happens if I select 10,000 feet? Whoa! Adds, what, almost 2 hours to the flight. How's 9,000 feet work? Better. How's 8,000 feet work? Oh, better yet, 534. How's 7,000 feet work? Well, not quite as good. And that's what happens as you keep going down. Remember, your true airspeed decreases as you go down in altitude. And this thing is calculating a combination of your true airspeed and the wind data that you gave it over here. And it's telling you the time this segment of the flight will take from French Frigate Shoals to the top of descent. So you can change your altitudes once you've given it all the data it needs and watch your times, and you can pick the optimum altitude for each section of the flight. And that's what we've got right now. So we're going to remember, after French Frigate Shoals, we're going to descend to 8,000 feet, and hopefully that'll get us out of some headwind. The last section of this, and the one we're going to use in flight most, is the navlog, and this is designed to be filled out as you fly. So before you take off, you'll fill out as much as you can for the first entry. This is the waypoint, basically, that you're at now, or starting from, you can think of it. So, of course, I selected waypoint 1. And you notice when you select one of these boxes, you get a drop-down arrow, and you can select your waypoints from the list. So we've selected Ford Island. When you cross the waypoint, or in our case, when we take off, we're going to enter the time we get airborne right here. And I'll go ahead and enter 1645. And that's not going to work. It requires a colon. 1645 Zulu, that's Zulu time, of course. Remember, red fields are fields it's calculated for you. Green fields are pieces of information you need to enter. You need to enter the variation for this point, which is 11 degrees east. You need to enter the temperature. Compass heading, we'll come back to that in a minute. Altitude, well, we're just starting out. Altitude's 0. Indicated airspeed is going to be 110 knots as we climb. And it needs wind data for the first leg of the flight, so I entered sort of an average value for the winds for our climb up to 10,000 feet out of Honolulu. After you do that, you then choose the next waypoint you want to fly to. I chose our top of climb waypoint. That's the lat long for it. It will now calculate a distance and a ground speed based on the wind you gave it and how long it thinks it will take you to get there. And this is what time it thinks you will get there. And then this is the time it thinks you will get to destination. Okay? 9 hours and 26 minutes away, ETA of 211. Zulu time. And that's how much distance you have left to run. And then you put in a fuel burn. This would be your takeoff fuel. And it'll calculate your used, your range, your endurance, so on. The compass heading column, be sure you enter the compass heading you fly. So it tells you to fly 283. That's what it's calculated you should fly to get to the top of climb waypoint. It wants you to fly a magnetic heading at 283, and here's its calculations for that, right? So if you take its advice and fly 283, you put it in there. You do something different, you put it in there. And then when you get to another waypoint, you either cross a waypoint that's on your flight plan, so you choose it from here, or you can enter the latitude and longitude, and it tells you this. So like if you take a celestial fix, you enter your latitude and longitude there, the time you were there, it will calculate, based on your compass heading, not only your ground speed to that point, but it will calculate the winds that affected you to get to that point. And so you'll have more a good wind calculation. And again, this is all explained in the instructions for this thing, so I'm beating it to death. You'll see as we fill it out as we go how it's going to work. I'll show it to you this time. But I think that about covers navigation planning. Let's go fly. Well, when I finished the navigation section, I ended with let's go fly. I had gotten so wrapped up in talking about the navigation that when I finished it, I had forgotten. I promised you one more spiel here. We need to talk about the HfDf, the HF direction finding equipment that basically made this flight possible. Celestial navigation and dead reckoning are great, and they work most of the time. But the problem was, for a couple legs of this trip, Pan Am was attempting to hit very small targets with these clippers. And if they missed the targets, the aircraft was just lost at sea. That was not an acceptable level of safety for aerial navigation for commercial service. Okay? Not even flying the mail. The government didn't want that much mail lost. Certainly not flying passengers. So Pan Am knew they needed more accurate direction finding. Now, radio direction finding, some of it kind of existed, but it was really in its infancy, and it was very short range, and it certainly wasn't suitable for crossing an ocean. So Juan Trippe, the president of Pan Am, he put a man named Hugo Luderitz in charge of this project, and it was really considered a top secret project to develop some proprietary navigation technology to make this flight possible. And when they did, they shared it with the Navy, and that was really about the only folks that got to use it for a while, and eventually it became commonly in use. They created a series of HF direction finding stations. And I'm going to tell you first how the HfDf actually worked, and then I will tell you how we are simulating it. There are some differences, but we wind up with about the same level of usefulness and the same level of inaccuracy that the real HfDf had, and so I think it's a good simulation. Now you can see we're trying to hit Midway Atoll. It is a small atoll, and if you miss it, there's one more island out here. There's Kauai Atoll. And, I mean, there's nothing at all. I take that back, there isn't. I didn't even know there was an airport out here. There wasn't in 1935. and then there's nothing but trackless ocean, right? Wake Island. This leg, the next leg from Midway to Wake, is considered the most demanding feat of navigation in the world. And if you missed Wake, and there's not much to Wake, it's even smaller than Midway. That's Wake Island. And if you miss Wake Island, you are lost in the very middle of the Pacific Ocean. There's nothing until you get to Guam, and you wouldn't have anywhere near enough fuel. So it was find Wake or be lost in the Pacific. So they set up these HF direction finders, and here's how they worked. Because receiver technology and antenna technology were clearly very, very basic back then, right? It worked the opposite of the way we think of radio direction finding today in aircraft. We think of tuning in a receiver in the aircraft to a ground transmitter and then homing to that ground transmitter, right? You couldn't put a receiver in an aircraft that could pick up these ground signals. It would have been too big, too heavy. The original antenna arrays, they used an Adcock-style antenna array, which was a series of loop antennas stretched across 4 telephone poles in a square shape, and a radio operator on the ground at the HfDf station could tune this antenna directionally and take a bearing on the clipper. The clipper would transmit a signal, and the ground radio operator would take a bearing on that signal. And he would then radio back to the clipper radio operator, okay, at this time you bear 085 from Midway Island. That's how the HfDf actually worked. Now, one important limitation of the HfDf, and this is simulated in our rendering of it, is when this radio operator tuned his antenna and tuned his antenna to look for the peak signal. Actually, he was looking for a null signal in this earlier equipment where the signal strength dropped to 0, okay? But when he tuned his antenna looking for the bearing to the clipper, he got a bearing, let's say he got 085. He got a null signal at 085. So he assumed the clipper was over here somewhere. Boy, you'd be way off course. I guess you'd be up here somewhere. But he assumed the clipper was up here, and he'd radio and say, okay, you're 085. But it was also possible that the clipper was on the reciprocal bearing of 265. So as the radio operator tuned his directional antenna array, he would get a signal null at 085, and he would get another signal null on the reciprocal of that at 265. And there was no to from indication. He had no way of knowing really which side of the station the clipper was on. Now, most of the time, you had a general idea that the clipper was, let's say we're only halfway into the flight, based on time. Obviously, the clipper's on the easterly bearing over here. But you'll notice that as you get closer to the station and you keep asking for bearings from the radio operator, there's no indication that you've crossed the station. And so, if you're lost or you're in low visibility and you're asking for radio help to find the station, if you ever fly Midway, let's say you're coming in from a 090 bearing, so you're over here to the east and you're coming in, the radio operator's taking bearings on you, he's getting 090, 090, 090, he's still getting 090, 090, 090. You're over here now. You're on the reciprocal of that 090. So the HfDf simultaneously helped the crew home in on the island, but it could be a trap as well, and have them flying a reciprocal bearing outward. So dead reckoning was still important. Celestial navigation was still important. The HfDf didn't replace that. It just supplemented it. Also, Hugo Luderitz, one of the things he did was transmit, one of his inventions was to use the HF, the high-frequency band, versus the low-frequency bands that were being used in radio direction finding before this. HF, high frequency, is great, but it's affected by atmospheric conditions locally, meaning thunderstorms, lightning, and HF is also affected drastically by solar activity, by sunspots, creating more or less solar wind that interacts with particles in the ionosphere, and that's what creates the aurora borealis and so on. That kind of solar activity can play hell with HF communication and HF signal strength. There were nights of ideal atmospheric and solar weather or space weather conditions where clippers out here by Guam, Alameda could get a bearing on them. But there were plenty of nights where the HfDf's range was limited to only about 500 or 600 miles as well. We're simulating that. So the strengths of HF, which means that it skips through the ionosphere and it's not limited by line of sight, it'll skip through the ionosphere and go all around the world. That's a strength of using the HF radio band, is also a weakness in that it is very susceptible to interference from both solar activity and local atmospheric conditions, thunderstorms. And so in our simulation, our HF's going to have a range of between 450 and 650 miles. That's good, a little bit worse than average, but good, accurate conditions will certainly be enough for us to find our islands. Well, I hope. I guess we'll find out. So here's how we are simulating this thing, okay? We are using a gauge called the weathership's gauge that was created by someone. I saw it on the A2A forum. It may exist elsewhere as well. And initially, this was not my plan to use the weathership's gauge. Initially, I was just going to create NDBs, set them to 600-mile ranges, and use this RF direction finding panel gauge that I found to home in on them. Well, it turns out you can't create an NDB in Flight Simulator with more than 100 miles range. So I wrote the guy who created this weatherships gauge and asked him how he made his weatherships with greater ranges. He, I think, very kindly quickly realized I was far over my head in terms of programming depth and offered to just add the HfDf stations to his weathership gauge. The weathership gauge is really cool. It was originally designed to simulate the location of weatherships. These were 1950s era technology. And he was nice enough to add ground-based radio stations that simulate the HfDf. So you'll notice there is one at Alameda, which we didn't use. They're the red pins here. There's one in Honolulu. There's one in Midway Island. There's one in Wake Island. And there's one at Guam. And there's one at Manila. So that's exactly the Pan Am HfDf network in the Pacific. That's what they had when they started the Pacific flying. Here's how this works, okay? Here's the Honolulu HfDf. Now, we get to play the part of the ground radio operator, basically, and take a bearing on ourselves, okay? And then we'll plot it on the map. Kind of cool that we get to play the part of the ground radio operator, and more importantly, it's not just Flight Simulator returning a radio for us. It introduces an element of human error. We can screw up just as easily as the human radio operator could. So, here is the HfDf. Well, here is the weathership gauge. Okay, it's what we're going to use to simulate the HfDf. You have to turn it on, and I'll go ahead and take a bearing on us from the Honolulu radio. As you click through here, you'll see the different frequencies. These are the weatherships. These are the HfDf stations that he's added, along with some other ground-based direction finding stations. So that's obviously in the Atlantic. Then we get over to our stations in the Pacific. Alameda, Anchorage was later. That wasn't part of the Pan Am network. And here we are in Honolulu. The frequency's 406. No, it's not an HF frequency. He had to use NDB level frequencies too because of a flight sim limitation. But this thing works far differently than an NDB. So we set up that 406. That's a frequency for Honolulu. We get a weather report from Honolulu. There's the weather right now. Great, nice. We also get a magnetic variation for our location, which is kind of cool. What you do is, first you set your heading here on the heading indicator. So our current magnetic heading is 147. So there's 140, there's one about 150, 149, 148, 147. A little bit of interpolation there, right? Then, here's the signal strength indicator, and it's very low right now because we're on the ground. If we were up even 500 feet, this would spike up. It's smart. It takes elevation into account for signal strength. So our signal strengths in the air will be much better, and the stronger signal strength you have, the more accurate your bearing. But for demonstration purposes, this will work. We are going to rotate the antenna array, and remember this is what the ground operator would be doing, rotating the antenna array. And see the signal strength meter over here? The ground operator, the HfDf operator, would in fact be looking for a signal null, where the signal dropped to 0. This is modeled the opposite way. We're looking for a signal peak. But it's okay. It accomplishes the same thing. We're tuning an antenna, looking for a particular indication on a needle, and then we're going to take that as a bearing. So, signal's climbing, going back down. If I click back 1 degree the other way, it goes up, then it goes down. If I click back the other way, up and then down. So in the middle right there, that's the highest point. And that is a course of what? 300 degrees, 310, 320. What do you want to call that? About 324? You see what I mean? You kind of have to interpolate this. That's the opportunity to introduce some error. This is exactly how the real equipment worked. I'm going to call that about 324. So we are then going to plot a 324 course line. This is the exact location of the HfDf station. In reality, I think this one would have been at Pearl City, but I wasn't going to bother with moving this one. It's fine where it is. So we're going to click a start position on the HfDf station, and we're going to draw a line of position. Hell, I forgot we said 324, right? So look in the ruler toolbox, look at the heading box, and 320, 321, 322, 323, 324. And you make this line as long as you think you need to encompass your position, right? 324.05, close enough. Click. I'll save the line. I'm going to start a convention of making radio-based LOPs a bright blue like this. That should show up. Yeah, shows up on the ocean, shows up on land. So bright blue lines are HfDf LOPs. Okay, and how'd it work? I know in reality that we are about right here, so yeah, pretty good considering it's a very low signal strength. We're on the ground. I'd say we're about right there, and yeah, you know, 0.2 of a mile off. I would consider that pretty bad considering we're only like 10 miles from the station. But it's because we're on the ground. If we were up even 1,000 feet or two, we'd have a much stronger signal strength, and that would be even more accurate. So that about covers the HfDf. We'll give it a try. We'll take some outbound bearings off of Honolulu, and like I said, the range is about 600 miles. So it won't cover the whole flight. You know, we'll lose Honolulu somewhere in the middle that we won't have picked Midway up yet, but that's fine. Especially on this leg with all our visual landmarks, no problem. But I'm excited. I haven't tried this on a flight. I've done a lot of testing with it, but I haven't tried it, and I expect that as we go, I'm going to learn some things about how to use it, some techniques. So I think that'll be fun. That really is enough talking. This time, let's really go fly. Alright, that is enough talking. As I expected, it ran longer than I thought it would. Just in case you skipped those sections real quick, there's our route from Honolulu to Midway. These are all visual checkpoints. They're islands. We're navigating with a dead reckoning log that asks for an initial heading of 284. We're going to supplement it with celestial shots of the Sun, the Moon, and Venus, and HfDf. So, our navlog wants 284 for an initial heading, and it is about time to get going. Wind's calm, we can take off straight ahead, which is to the south-southeast. One thing I'll show you that I didn't really think about when I planned this flight, because I was thinking about being at altitude. According to this, we have to take off and pick up this 284 line, which takes us over a ridge of mountains that, according to Google Earth, is, yeah, you know, 2,700 feet high. Not sure if we'll clear those, honestly. We're heavy again, so I'm going to take off and I'm going to actually make a left turn and a climbing loop around Pearl Harbor and then over Ford Island, and that'll give us a little climbing room. Sound like a plan? We're right at gross weight. The fuel's set up accurately. The load is set up accurately. There's not much in the way of before takeoff, just a trim setting, which the manual for this aircraft recommends about 4 degrees nose up, and that's never enough to get it off the water. I'm going to try 10 this time, because I end up having to trim back to get it off the water. Alright. Our initial heading is set in our Sperry autopilot of 284. Altimeter setting set, DG synced. The cowl flaps are finicky on this thing, but they do like to be open for takeoff to 4, and then you bring them back to 2 for cruise. Alright. We are cleared for takeoff. It's just after dawn. So long, Honolulu. There's the range of mountains we need to get over. Here we go. Takeoff at 57, 58. Takeoff at 58. There she's up on step. Oh yeah, we're heavy. Come on, girl. There she goes. There she goes. Alright, that's Ford Island. I know I said I was going to take a turn around the north side of Pearl Harbor. We'll go out over the Honolulu International Airport, make a left turn back around Pearl Harbor. How about that? Time to reduce to climb power, which is certainly going to hurt our terrain clearance abilities here. There's Diamond Head and Honolulu, just to the left of the nose there. Looks like a nice foggy morning over there, huh? Ah, we're coming up on 1,000 feet. We should be able to clear those mountains, no problem. Alright, there's Ford Island down there. Gonna fly right over the Arizona Memorial, but of course we're 6 years too early for that. Climbing a little steeper than we flight planned for. That's because I want to get over those mountains. Okay, that's just about the center of Pearl Harbor. We want to be on a 284 heading. I'm going to go ahead and turn the autopilot on, just to let it fly precise headings, and man, we're almost there. And you can see the mountains we're heading for. She wants just a little bit of right rudder in the climb yet. Let's just verify that heading while we're climbing out, shall we? Yeah, it was 284. And I'll enter it in the flight plan now that we're flying 284. All the times are in Zulu, might as well fill these out. We were off at 16:45. Well, I'm sorry, we were off the blocks at 16:45. We said we were off the ground, or the water, at 16:57, I believe it was, yes? That makes sense, yeah. Estimating top of climb at 1724. We'll see how that works out. Well, it's going to be embarrassing if we don't clear these mountains. So long, Honolulu. Imagine that was an enjoyable overnight in 1935. Boy, Diamond Head is really prominent from this angle, isn't it? Even back in the haze like that. Absolutely recognizable. And there's Pearl Harbor, West Lock, Middle Lock with the Pearl City Peninsula, and East Lock. And Ford Island. And some mountains that I'm starting to feel better about clearing. I've got the engine noise turned down a little bit so that my voiceovers are a little more understandable, so I hope that doesn't make the airplane sound too weird. I might kick them back up a little bit for the next section. And just as I say that, the voice shift, or the sound shifts. The sound characteristics on this airplane, they tend to come in and out. I don't really know why. It's just a kind of a idiosyncrasy of the model. Alright though, I think we're going to top that. Looks like we're coming up to about 2400 now, so I think we should be above the highest terrain. Would I actually cut a mountain topping in and out of the clouds this close in real life? No, absolutely not. And if this was any more in question, even in the sim, I would have just wrapped around the south side of Oahu and picked up our course off the west side. But in the interest of seeing how accurate our dead reckoning can be, I did want to try this, so we'll try it. Just pick up the course straight out. We're good. We're good. We got these mountains cleared. Alright. Be back with you at top of climb. We should overfly Kauai, and we'll be off on course. Well, we haven't made it too far yet, but I just wanted to show you a couple means of navigation here. We're straight over Kauai right now. It's the next and last of the major islands of the Hawaiian Islands, so we'd left Oahu, and we're over here over Kauai. Visually, I can tell you that we coasted in right over Lihue. I took our hack just about right there. I should change that to the time. I was starting to worry because I wasn't seeing Lihue, and I thought I should have, so I took a sun shot for a speed line just to verify that we hadn't missed it yet. And I got the island in sight through the clouds right afterwards, so that worked out just well. The last thing we want to verify is we're going to take a HfDf shot. So, we're flying a heading at 285. And I've got 285 set in my heading indicator here on the HfDf gauge. There's 290, 89, 88, 87, 86, and 85. We're adjusting our loop antenna for a peak. There's a peak, there's a null, there's a peak, there's a null, there's a peak. Going to go right about there, and we're going to call it about 300, 297. Let's call it 297 because there's one good shot on the other side of that too. So 297. So what we would have done is we would have requested the HfDf radio operator to take a bearing on us just to verify navigation was working well, and he did it, and he radioed back 297. So we would now plot the 297 bearing on our chart. 297, just about exactly. Save. We said we are going to make HfDf shots this color. And here we have a HfDf bearing that crosses right through the center of Kauai. Perfect. So that all validates that we are right on course. Instead of using the top of climb waypoint, which this navlog put a little bit in the wrong spot, I actually put a lat long in there. And we hit it at 1747. So let's go ahead and change the name of this place mark here to 1747. And since it is now an actual position, it's not just a checkpoint we're trying to hit, but it's an actual position, I'll change it to my diamond indicator. And we've got Nihoa, which is the next piece of land we're supposed to hit, selected as our next waypoint. That being the case, it's telling us to steer 285, and we're doing it 285. So far, our fuel calculations are looking good. We've got endurance of 14 hours and 1,600 miles. And we've only got less than 1,100 miles to fly and a little over 9 hours. So far, so good. All our methods of navigation are working. We are on course. We are pressing for Nihoa, and I will talk to you when we get there. And since we have the luxury of having multiple means of navigation on this leg, I figured we'd use them. We're about halfway now between Kauai and our first little island here of Nihoa. And we were estimating a ground speed, or our flight plan, based on the wind data we gave, it was estimating a ground speed of 146. So I picked a time that would have put us about halfway between the two islands. I took a sunshot for a speed line, which we got here, measured the distance that yielded from our last known position, and the time it took to fly it, ran a quick time speed distance computation, came up with a ground speed of 130 knots. I took another HfDf bearing, or shall we say requested another HfDf bearing off of Honolulu, and that's this blue line here. So that puts us a few miles right of course, but again, once you get to be, 100-something miles away, how far away are we from HfDf now? 165 miles away. That's probably an acceptable margin of error, so I didn't make a course correction for that. But I'm guessing the ground speed was pretty good, and that gives us a revised estimate for Nihoa of, I calculated 1855. Our spreadsheet here, based on the ground speed it thought we would fly, based on the flight plan winds, said we would be at Nihoa at 1847. I say 1855. Handy place to keep notes for all this. We'll see what happens. Well, here we are approaching Nihoa. When I got it in sight, I did have to correct a few degrees to the left to overfly it, so we would have been slightly north of it. We'll take that into account. Popped up the sextant gauge here for a time. We're rolling up on 1853. Perhaps it's cheating to use an outside view to look around, but I have a feeling that even with the track IR system, I can't see out the window as well as these guys could have. They probably had hatches to look, well, yeah, they did. They had a drift meter to look straight down on, so we'll go ahead and cheat, use the outside view to figure out when we're right over Nihoa for a time hack. Looks like we need a few degrees more left. Couple degrees yet, more left. And we are supposed to make a turn when we get to Nihoa. I do know that, so have to check my navlog for that. There is a drift meter gauge, and I didn't install it because I wasn't thinking we would use it, but on this lake we would have, and we're definitely drifting to the right here. We definitely have more of a wind from the south. But okay, that's Nihoa. We'll call it at 1854. I'd say my estimate was a little bit more right on. 1854, and let's get a left turn going here. Let's start a left turn. And then figure out exactly what we need here. So, we crossed Nihoa, and we know that was Nihoa. That was positive identification, so we can use it from the drop-down list. At 1854 Zulu. Since I had to correct left, I'm going to change my compass heading. To fly to Nihoa and hit it, we would have, let's say we would have had to fly 283, and that'll let it recalculate a more accurate wind. This leg from Nihoa to Necker has a variation of 10 degrees east still, so we'll add 10 degrees east. Temperature. It is 10 degrees Celsius. We're at 10,000 feet. We're indicating 115 knots again. We're looking for Necker next. And yep, ground speed of 131 knots is what it thinks we're doing now. I calculated 130. Not bad. Oh, fuel. We need a fuel hack. No! Clicked the wrong thing there. Well, shoot. That screwed up this video segment, but I'm not going to go back and refly over Nihoa, so you'll just have to wait until my rather slow simulator scenery pops up this dialogue so I can cancel it. Cancel. Fuel and payload. Why am I doing this? I'll explain it to you in a minute. 2702. We say passing Necker. That's 2702 gallons, which is the only way I can read the fuel in this airplane, times 6. Gives us 16,212 pounds of fuel. 16,212 pounds of fuel. Which still gives us plenty of range to get to destination. And it wants us to fly a magnetic heading now of 271. I think we better fly that, 271. I had turned us too far. Yeah. Alright. So we will fly a heading at 271. I'll put that in for now so I don't forget. Our ground speed calculation was right on halfway to Nihoa. We are now estimating Necker Island at 0111. No, I take that back. At 2005, I didn't think that sounded right. In 1 hour and 11 minutes. And we'll see you then. Well, given the length that this video has already achieved with those two sections on the Dead Reckoning navigation and the HfDf, I think we'd better end part 1 of it here, and we'll make this a 2-part video. Part 2 will complete the flight to Midway, and the good news is subsequent legs and subsequent videos will be a lot shorter because we don't have any more lessons to cover. We've covered the history, we've covered navigation, we've covered the HfDf. From here on out, we can just worry about flying. So, thanks for coming along, and stay tuned for part 2 of our flight from Honolulu to Midway.